Okay, welcome to the latest edition of the Right Brain Warm-Up. This edition is kind of a social change special about creativity with three unbelievably amazing and inspiring people. So I might just run you through them. We've got Tom Whitty up the top there, Fabian Marrone below, and then Tanya Hosch next to Fabian. I might just do a little intro for everyone so everyone at home knows who I'm talking about. So Tanya is the General Manager, Inclusion and Social Policy for the Australian Football League. She was formerly the Joint Campaign Manager for Recognise and was a founding director of the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre. She's also the most incredible force of nature I've ever met in my life. So thanks for joining us, Tanya. Fabian is the Chief Marketing Officer of Monash University and a key driver behind their platform, if you don't like it, change it. In 2019, he was named the Chief Marketing Officer of the Year by the Australian Marketing Institute. He's also a man I deeply admire for his commitment to leading future generations to take care of this planet. I think it's just wonderful stuff you're doing at Monash and teaching kids, the next generation, to do the right thing. And finally, Tom is a journalist, musician, and television executive producer. He was executive producer of ABC TV's Australia Talks. He's the former and managing editor of The Project, and is also the creator and host of the new podcast Time to Die. And he's also won 5 UN Day Media Awards, which is the equal most in history, and he's younger than probably everyone else combined. It's unbelievable how much you guys have all achieved in your life. So what I'm going to do is, first thing I'm going to do, I'm asking this question to every single person who's come on is, we might start with you, Tom. What is creativity to you?
It's a great question. It's really tough. I had to think about it. For me, it's a necessity. Being creative, it's pretty much defined every part of who I am since I was a kid. So, choosing a career, it was all about when I left high school, I just wanted to do something where I knew I'd be able to make creative choices every day. And I didn't care what that was. I didn't care what course I got into, as long as I knew that at the end of it, I was going to be able to do that. Because, creativity for me it's medicinal. It's, something that really helps me regulate my mood. I consume other people, the spoils of other people's creativity constantly. It's what makes me excited. It's what makes me enjoy life. Other people's creations. Is that an answer?
Yeah,
sort of an answer.
No, it's an amazing answer. And Fabian, what about you? What's creativity to you? And in relation to you and in the role that you're maybe currently doing?
Yeah, look, I think creativity for me is telling the story of making something, or the reason of why you're making something. So it's a big part of it for me is the storytelling of the purpose and the concept of kind of how you developed something and how you got to that and why you went through that process of developing it and communicating that out to the world. And more importantly than ever now, communicating with a purpose is so important.
Yeah, I think it is a part of creativity is getting it out to other people, not just yourself. Do you find that a similar thing, Tanya? What's creativity to you?
Creativity to me is not something that I feel terribly well equipped to answer, to be honest. I admire people who are creative. I definitely am inspired by creativity. I think, though, sometimes culture is interpreted as creativity as a way to help people feel more comfortable with it. I think sometimes, traditional cultures can be presented in a way as an art form just to try and get people to think about it in a more open way. So I think creativity is incredibly important. I think there's part of all of us that yearns for creativity, wants to engage in creativity. And I think that, some of the hardest questions that we face as a society are only going to be addressed with the most creative minds and, really thinking outside the box and really being prepared to think beyond what, the usual boundaries of expectation are. And I think that's something that challenges us, but it's a really important part of helping us as a society to thrive.
Like in your role, I think that word challenging us is really spot on. I mean, how do you sort of see that challenging creativity being able to unlock those difficult issues that sometimes need to be talked about?
Yeah, I think it's creativity is often what we turn to when we're trying to think about how to communicate complex ideas, challenging ideas, things that people aren't that comfortable talking about. I mean, I think about the years and years of work, decades that's gone into trying to help Australia engage with its First Peoples in an honourable and equitable way. And I think there's been an enormous amount of ingenuity, innovation and creativity that's gone into thinking about the different ways to communicate what the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experience is. And I'm really grateful for the people that had sort of turned their minds to that and have taken up those opportunities to help present those stories in a way that might make them more accessible or hopefully reach a much broader audience of people who wouldn't typically be overly open to sit down and have those conversations in a direct way. I think that when I think about even, the Australian Football League, there's a lot of creativity that goes into the positioning of a game that's been with us for over 100 years and will always be traditional in some ways and static in some ways, because we always do want to honour tradition deep down inside at some level, but then there's always this necessity to try and maintain relevance and currency in a society that has got a lot of other choices about how it's entertained. And I do think that, part of what that delivers to all of us is a sense of belonging when we can find ourselves intersecting at the same place in relation to these sort of creative pursuits.
Yeah, and I think that's so spot on. It's amazing what you can do when you've got a platform to affect lots of different people. Like Tom, obviously, when you were managing editor of the project, you worked very closely with Waleed Ali on quite a few of his opinion pieces to chat. Like, I think that was interesting, Tanya, saying getting it to a broad audience, to people who wouldn't normally accept it. So how have you found using creativity to do that? And maybe you've given an example or two of what you've done in your career.
Okay. Yeah, well, I definitely agree. Taking a creative approach when you've got the resources to reach a large number of people is vital. Holding anyone's attention now is almost impossible. So, taking a creative approach is a must. With the project, I created that segment, something we should talk about, which for a few years there was quite popular on Facebook. Before that segment, the project, we didn't have an opinion section essentially. So I wanted to introduce that when Malee came on board. And so I wrote a bunch of different stuff. We wrote a lot of it together, but initially it was just me writing it. So I wrote about things like the renewable energy target, which the government and opposition have been fighting over for 2 years or even longer. They couldn't come to an agreement on it. So basically it was a stalemate that suited all parties involved, and it meant that we weren't aiming for anything because they couldn't agree on what it was. But just talking about this with anyone around the office or with my friends, they were bored out of their brains. So I tried to choose topics like that I thought, well, if I can turn this into an interesting thing. So, with the renewable energy target, I explained the history of this thing and in Australia, and also what was going on around the world at the same time. So, while there's 80% of renewable energy in Ireland, we've got 0%. New Zealand's got 100% for the first 3 months of the year, or whatever it was, and sort of showed it with these amazing graphics and that sort of thing. People could get their head around what was a potentially boring topic really quickly. Visually, it was stimulating. It was told in a creative way. It was I filled it full of jokes and stuff as well. And I think within about 3 weeks, we had a renewable energy target in Australia after that, which was great. And so sort of early success with that particular one. I basically just replicated that. So I did it with, like what I call blood milk, or farmers call blood milk, which is cheap milk in Australia, which was killing us, and the unfair retrospective debt that was placed on them by the dairy processors like Murray Goulburn. Australia wasn't talking about that. That had been going on for about 6 weeks. Our agriculture minister at the time, Barnaby Joyce, hadn't said anything about it. So I wrote this thing for lead, and we got $500 million in loans approved by the federal government for farmers so that they could basically maintain their farms.
All the dollar milk was being left on the shelves for a while, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Buy this with good faith.
Yeah, so it had a massive impact on that. And but again, that was a really, even trying to sell it to my bosses at the time, it's like, this is what I want to write about, this is the next one. They're like, nah, it's just not there, They couldn't find it interesting. When I finally got them over the line, because what I would do when I was writing those pieces is, after I'd written them, I would film them. They look like they're live, but they're pre-recorded. I'd pre-record them in the hour before the show would go to air. I'd call a bunch of media and say, listen, we're going to drop another one of these things tonight. Here's the headline. I just couldn't get anyone excited about it. So I think I made it. It was like Waleed Ali's greatest call to arms: eat more cheese. Which was essentially like, what the farmers were telling us was that there are certain products you can buy right now that'll help us. But by being creative and trying to make those stories really easy to engage with and interesting and funny at times and all that sort of thing, it had a massive impact on a huge audience. It changed behaviour, and we did, 15, 20 times, and got hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding for various causes, domestic violence services and all sorts of things.
And it's amazing. And obviously, a bit like the clever thing that you did was you introduced Waleed, but you also would make them quite light. You'd have little jokes here and there and stuff like that, just to get people to engage and to lean forward, so then they could listen to the serious message. Fabian, obviously, the brand campaign you're doing at Monash is brilliant. Is if you don't like it, change it. So obviously, sounds like a similar approach in that you're trying to engage people who maybe are apathetic to messages, and you get young people excited about something. They might come to Monash and just try and improve the world a bit. Is that kind of the way you're doing things at Monash?
Yeah, I mean, Monash is a huge organisation that does research in so many different, really important topics, from modern slavery and domestic violence through to imagining new ways and new energy sources across a whole different spectrum. And we were we were looking at bringing to life what Monash stood for and the value proposition. And when we went through and uncovered all of this fantastic research, we wanted to figure out a way to tell it to the world. And we found that when these topics were discussed, people would, have a comment on social media and just say, we're really not happy with this, and then move on. And they would feel like they had played their part in solving that problem for society because they'd made a comment on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn. But more importantly, we wanted to channel people and say there is a way that you can actually be part of the solution beyond just stating that there is a problem, and that is through research and education. Now, not everyone will go down the road of a tertiary education, not everyone will go into research, but in understanding and in entering the debate in terms of how different solutions can approach solving different problems, we start to create a community and an environment of where we're having discussion from a base of knowledge, and we're actually becoming part of the solution rather than just going out there and being part of the noise, which is saying this is a really bad problem in society, someone needs to fix it. Actually, it's reversing that and saying, if you've got a problem and you don't like something in the world, get off your couch, get off your mobile phone, come to Monash or go to any university or any platform and work on the solution, and either become the next generation who's part of the change through education, or get involved in the research to solve the problem, or just have a discussion from a base of knowledge. So there was a brand campaign element of if you don't like it, change it, but it was underpinned by a platform which was called A Different Lens, and Lens, which translated research, and sometimes quite complex and really important research, into the news cycle, which meant that rather than something being in the news and it just floating by, the university would then align and talk about its research in relation to what was happening in the news cycle. And you can see that, really relevant today. All of the research that's going on at Monash around COVID-19 and the likelihood that it may increase domestic violence, and putting that into the narrative and how it's going to affect the economy, and how it will increasingly compound the effects in disadvantaged groups. So beyond just the health risks, it's about broadening out the conversation so people are very aware of others' circumstances of their fellow person next to them.
Mm. And Tanya, in your role at the AFL, obviously you have a very broad audience, but you use that audience to have, you actually have some quite difficult conversations and sort of, again, trying to get the masses to sort of talk about some of the things like obviously the Doug Nicholls round and things like that. Do you find that there's a lot of pushback, or do you find like people are open to these things? Like, how are you finding getting messages across in the creative ways that people will take them, like the guys have just been talking about?
Yeah, look, I think, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's contribution to the game of Aussie rules is been significant and has been for a long time. It's really interesting, though, that I don't feel like there's an enormous amount of pushback, to be honest. I think that the audience, the football audience, is sort of, they've all got, Aboriginal players that they support by virtue of the number of them that are playing in their various teams. Some of the greatest players ever to have played the game have been Aboriginal men. So sometimes there's a disconnect, though. So people can be racist towards an Aboriginal player from an opposing team, but would never think to do that to one of their own Aboriginal players, but will also be quite quick to judge if an Aboriginal player from their own side, drops form. So there's an interesting relationship and dynamic, and I think depth of understanding between what you think is okay behaviour. In some places, there's still people who love footy who think that sledging is an okay thing to do and wouldn't have any boundaries about what kind of sledging it is and see it as part of the game. I think it was really interesting last year when, two different documentaries about the experience of Adam Goodes hit Australians, and that was a great opportunity for us because it meant revisiting a time that was really difficult in the league's history, and one that had never been quite, the conversation never quite been consolidated to a final outcome. Adam doesn't participate in football in any way. I mean, I know he still, does things for the Sydney Swans, who he loves and who he feels stood by him. But, in terms of football more generally, that's been a massive loss. I think I definitely saw through both of those films people who had sworn to me that, Adam Goodes and the booing had nothing to do with race or racism previously. And there were some people who still felt that, even having watched the films. There were some people who refused to watch the films because they refused to even engage with the potential that there was a different side of the story that they might not have seen or understood. But then there were a lot of people who did change their minds because they did watch it. And so I think you can never give up hope that everything you try is going to reach someone somewhere, and every single one of those people counts. And I think when we're talking about something as predominant as racism, in a context where I think our country still doesn't like having that conversation, I think there's a lot of conversations that our nation would prefer to have than have the conversation about racism. But the journey that, footy's been on by virtue of the participation of blackfellas in our game has meant that, a fair journey has been travelled. And I think a lot of our fans, love the Indigenous contribution to the game. Sir Doug Nicholls' round is incredibly popular. And even when you watch the medal presentation after a grand final, some of the players that are most cheered for are the Aboriginal players or the Muslim players, which we saw after the grand final last year. There's a huge cheer for Bashir Hooley when he got up on stage to get his medal. Massive cheer for Marlon Pickett, who just played his first game of senior football. And so there's lots of examples that give me reason to think that it doesn't pay to underestimate people's capacity to engage with something that challenges them. And I think it's up to all of us to keep trying to find ways to do that. But I also accept that people don't want to feel like they're being hit over the head with a message every day. You know, I don't want to be hit over the head with a message every day. I feel like my life is one big message, to be honest. But, you know, there are times where I don't want to be doing that. I want to binge watch stuff on TV that hasn't got any strong moral code whatsoever. You know, I want to talk to my friends about, you know, nonsense, but there are things that I think are innate within us to connect with other people, and sometimes there are things that get in the way with those connections, and I feel like there's always going to be a drive amongst, hopefully, a majority that wants to overcome what gets in the way of some of our connections.
I think
I don't know if that made sense.
No, it totally makes sense. I think it's interesting. So you're talking about Bashahuli, and there's obviously in the news you read a lot about how kind of racist we Australians can be. But then, like, obviously, Tom, you work with Waleed Ali, and he won a gold Logie. Like, who would have thought 10 years ago that someone like that would win a gold Logie? And that's the most populist award that you can have in Australia, pretty much. It's pretty amazing what that people can actually be open to if they just exposed to it sometimes, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Waleed's, you know, he's a remarkably eloquent guy, and he's the kindest, most gentle person I've ever met. And he, you know, he's probably the most intelligent person I've ever met as well. But he wears all of that on his sleeve. So anyone who actually knows him basically just falls in love with the guy. And
also loves his footy too, doesn't he? Massive.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, he's a huge Tigers fan. But yeah, so I'm sure it came as a huge surprise to Waleed that he won it. And I think he referenced the the racial element. The first thing he said was, "Do not adjust your screens," when he won. But I, to anyone who knows him and has worked alongside him, it wasn't a surprise at all, because his contribution to Australian television has been amazing, and he's only been doing it for maybe 10 years.
Yeah. Again, as well, like both of you trying to get to the young people. Obviously, Fabian, that's what you guys are trying to do. Do you find anything of the racial element on campus that you have to? Is it more inclusive, or is there more different cultures coming through and stuff? How's that working for you guys?
Look, I think we are a very inclusive environment. It's such a multicultural group of people, students, particularly when you have so many coming from overseas, so many coming from regional parts of Australia, and you have the domestic cohort and all different demographics. I often find that it's not the cohorts of individuals on campus at all where we see the racism and issues evolve like that. There's those pieces, sometimes around campus and in the media that tend to bring some of that narrative into play, rather than what we actually see physically eventuate on campus. I mean, campuses are a place of healthy debate, and there is a lot of debate around different issues, but it's done so in the most in a really positive light. Certainly is what we find, but there are always your occasional incidences that happen everywhere, and I guess communities like campuses mimic societies in many ways. We're 50,000 people on Clayton at any one time. It's a community. It's the size of some cities, so it has the infrastructure and the same type of dynamics that you find there. But things are heavily debated out in open in a campus environment, and that's part of what's wonderful about being on a university. It's that freedom of that academic freedom and freedom of speech that really thrives, and you see it more so than you do now, obviously, because there's not many people on campus, but usually you can hear the debate when you walk past young people, and that's actually quite an exciting vibe that it gives, that people are voicing those things. And it's nice to see discussions like that voice person to person, and sometimes just on those channels where you can't necessarily, like social media, where you can't necessarily have that interaction.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for that discussion. What we might do now, this part of the segment, we get to a bit where we ask a question from the Right Brain Workout. So you guys have prepared an answer, and people listening at home have a think about your answer. So the question that we've got is from Anthony Simmons. He's a Clemenger BBDO creative director. He was my art director for about 10 years. So he's a good man too. So his question was, think of your earliest memory, write down what you think happened just before that. So perhaps we'll start with Tom. Let's go with Tom this time.
Okay, great. So I was thinking about this. My earliest memory was my older brother, who was about 8 years older than me, coming home from, he was in primary school. I was just a really little toddler, coming home from primary school with a new bike, which I just knew nothing about. So it was, I had to remind me what the question was. Was it what happened right before your earliest memory?
Right before your earliest memory, yep.
Right, so I just had my brother stole a bike.
Did he? You don't know?
No, I'm sure he didn't, but we're being creative, right?
Yeah, I love it. It's great. What about you, Tanya? What's your earliest memory and what happened just before it?
Look, I think I was probably sitting quietly in the lounge room with my parents. So I reckon I was about 4 years old. And my earliest memory is going into the kitchen and for the first time attempting to pour myself a glass of orange juice. And I remember my parents coming in and sort of catching me. And obviously I must have been incredibly adorable doing it because they had this big smile on their face. So probably a mix of, I hope she doesn't empty that bottle all over herself. And, isn't that cute? Me on my toes trying to reach up to the sink to pour myself, a glass of orange juice from a heavy plastic bottle. But I'm pretty sure I was probably snuck out of the lounge room away from my parents to do it on my own.
Yeah.
It's probably the sign of things to come, really. That sort of
first form of independence,
tenaciousness. Yeah.
That's great. I can just imagine my daughter doing it right now. I'm like, God, please stop! Oh no, but do it.
Yeah.
Stop. What about you, Fabian?
Surprisingly, my earliest memory involves citrus fruit as well, actually. So,
right, there you go.
My parents had some friends over, and it was quite late at night, and I had walked into the lounge room past the dining table where they were all sat, plonked myself on the rug, and was actually sick everywhere. And the reason that was because what I was doing just before that was eating a full bag of mandarins and probably most of the skin as well. So it was quite a gross first memory. And I think it's my first memory because it was a bit disturbing.
Can you have mandarins now?
I still love them.
Right, very good. It's not like your first time getting drunk and you can never have that alcohol again. You keep going back to the mandarin.
No, I still can't drink Jim Beam.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, me too. I can't either.
What about you, Tom? Are you Jim Beam?
No, man, I've actually had the same thing. I drank Jim Beam when I was 18, way too much of it, and I've never touched it since.
There you go. There's a marketing campaign in that. All right, so we might wrap it up with one last question. With all the world that's going on with now, what's the most important thing you would say to people right now to help with what's happening? Tanya, perhaps.
Look, I just think, I'm someone that lives with depression. And so managing your mental health is incredibly important. I know, from my research and, lots of doctors' appointments over the time that, socialising when you least feel like it is a really good thing to do, and forcing yourself out to be with people. So not being able to do that at the moment. And, I'm almost in that age bracket for blackfellas where the government says, well, if you're 70, don't go out. If you're Indigenous, you've got to stay home if you're 50. I'm not quite there, but I'm not far off. So for me,
you know why
getting
the
out
reason
and
they're saying that? You know what the reason is for that?
Yeah.
That huge discrepancy?
Well, just because of our the chronic health burden that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have. I tick all of those boxes actually because I've got type 2 diabetes, I've got an autoimmune condition. My life is generally pretty stressful as well. So, I'm ticking all the boxes. One of my good friends, Aboriginal woman, said, "Oh, you should go home and drink a bottle of champagne and celebrate that you tick all the boxes." But that's exactly the opposite of what I really should do. But I'm saving it up. But I think being self-aware about what you need and then knowing how to get help to get that, because I think we're all going to cope really differently through this period. And, you know, I don't feel socially isolated, but I am missing being with people in person. You know, fortunately, I don't live alone. So, you know, I know I'll be okay, but I am missing that kind of deeply sort of more interpersonal contact. So I think, because if you're self-aware and you know what the things are you're really going to need, then rather than turning to coping mechanisms that may not be so helpful, which any of us could do at any time under stress, it's important to be self-aware and reach out and say to other people, can you help me work out how to solve this? You know, maybe creatively speaking, you know, how do I deal with this loss that I have that is a normal part of how I sort of manage myself and, you know, sustain myself. So I think being self-aware and doing some of that reflection, which if you're busy, you often don't have time to do, is probably a really useful thing to do right now.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant advice. Fabian, it sounds like there's if you don't like it, change it in the health discrepancy with Indigenous, with you know, other people. I think there's something that needs to be done about that, obviously. Fabian, what about you? What advice have you got for people?
Look, I'm looking at it as a case of, you know, everything is temporary. I mean, it might be a bit longer than we'd all hoped to be in this position, but it is still temporary. And I always like to think it's, you know, it's not what knocks us down, but it's what we do to then get up and redefine ourselves through that process that really matters. We'll look back and say, how did we come out of this, and how did we evolve, and how did we learn, and how did we treat people? And were we compassionate, and were we kind, and did we look after each other through that process, and did we create great things while we had this time in isolation, and while we had the opportunity to rethink things, because the world is going to need to go back to some type of normal, whatever that will look like, and we're going to need new solutions, and we're going to need new ways to do things, and we're going to need new heroes and new rock stars and a whole bunch of new things that come out of this. So this is temporary. Spend the time creating something beautiful so you can show the world afterwards, and make something really great out of a really really rubbish situation. I had to pause so I didn't swear. But you know, it's an opportunity to create something beautiful.
Awesome. That's brilliant advice. I'm going to try and do that. Now, Tom, what about you?
Well, I mean, we're all kind of creative people. You probably heard one of the things I've just hated hearing my entire life is you've got too much time on your hands. It's, you know, it's like the catch cry of the uninspired. It's any time I ever did anything that was sort of, you know, for the sake of doing something creative, anyone who didn't get what that was about would say that. But right now we've all got too much time on our hands. So I think that's an opportunity, you know, and it is temporary. But there's an opportunity here. And like I said earlier, you know, for me, creativity is medicinal. So I think there's an opportunity here for all of us to sort of treat ourselves to the sort of things that you do when you've got too much time on your hands. Go out into the garden and you know, create something, you know, even if you've got a tiny little patch or you've got a balcony or something like that, plant a little succulent that you would never have done and watch it grow and appreciate that. Or, you know, jump on YouTube. I did this yesterday. You know, I used to do a lot of art and I haven't drawn for a little while. So I got on YouTube and looked at a class on how to draw the human form and reminded myself of how to do that. And I started writing music again, which I haven't done for, you know, a few months. There's an opportunity here for us to do some really cool stuff, you know, and I think this is a horrific time. It is. It's really concerning and it makes us all really anxious. But it's also a time where I think massive change is going to come about, and it's so exciting to see. You know, this could be the destruction of, you know, the neoliberal trajectory that we've been on. There might be I hope a universal basic income comes in, and there's an opportunity here for all of us to pursue creative pursuits, and create the stuff that at the moment is nourishing us, the stuff like Netflix and listening to music and all the things that are getting us by through this really horrible time. There's an opportunity for all of us to be doing that. So my suggestion would be to invest in that stuff.
Awesome. That's brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for your time. I'm going to say thanks for everyone for listening as well. When in doubt, turn to your right side and hopefully speak to you guys soon. Have a good one.